Hello, 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 hello. Towards modernization, displacing indigenous people, path to modernization. Towards modernization, in the previous section, you have learned about certain crucial developments in the medieval and early modern world. Feudalism, the European Renaissance, and the encounters between Europeans and the peoples of the Asia, Africa, and Americans. As you would have realized, some of the phenomena that contributed to the making of our modern world gradually evolve in the period, and especially so from the mid 15th century onwards. Two further developments in the world history created a contest for what has been called modernization. These were the Industrial Revolution and a series of political revolution. That transformed subjects into citizens, beginning with the American Revolution in 1776 to 81 and the French Revolution in 1789 to 94. Britain has been world's first industrial nation. For long it was believed that British industrialization provided the model for industrialization in other countries. However, historians have begun to question some of the earlier ideas about the industrial revolution. Each country drew upon the experiences of other nation without necessary reproduction and reproducing any model of other nation without necessarily reproducing any model. In Britain, for instance, coal and cotton textile industries were developed in the first phase of the industrialization, while the developed in the first phase industrialization, while the intervention of railways initiated the second stage of the process. In other countries such as Russia, which began to industrialize in a much later, from the late 19th century onwards, the railways and other heavy industries emerged in the initial phase of industrialization itself. Likewise, the role of state and of industrialization, the role of state and of banks in industrialization has differed from country to country. The British case no doubt influenced the industrialization. It is the picture of linking the world in 1927. Charles Lindbergh, 25 years old, flew across the Atlantic Ocean from New York to Paris in a single engine aeroplane. Trajectories of other nations such as the USA and Germany, two significant industrial powers. It also played the human and material cost incurred by the Britain on its industrialization. The plight of the laboring poor, especially of children's environmental degradation, and the consequent epidemics of cholera and tuberculosis. In theme 7, you will read how industrial pollution and cadmium and mercury poisoning in Japan steered people into the mass movement against indecent settlers did to the native peoples of America and Australia. The bourgeois mentality of the settlers made them buy and sell everything, meant including land and water. But the native, who appeared uncivilized to the European Americans, asked, if you do not own the freshness of air and sparkle of water, how can one buy them? The native did not feel the need of to own land. Things needed to be exchanged. They could be simply be gifted. Quite obvious. The natives and the Europeans represented completing notation of civilization. The former did not allow the European delegate to wipe out their cultures, although the US and Canadian governments of mid 20th century desired native to join the mainstream, and Australian authorities of same period attempted to simply ignore their tradition and culture. One might wonder what it means by mainstream. How does the economic and political powers influence the making of mainstream culture? It is the picture of linking the world. J. Lipstick figure sculptured in the 1920s shows the influence of Central African statuaries. Linking the world. Japanese Zen painting like this one were admitted by the Western artist and influenced the abstract expressionist style of painting in the 1920s in the USA. Western capitalist, mercantile, industrial and financial, and early 20th century Japanese capitalism created colonies in the large part of third world. Some of these were settlers colonies. Others, such as British rule of India, are examples of direct, and early 20th century China illustrated a third variant, and early 20th century China illustrated the third variant of imperialization. There, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, America, and Japan meddled in China affairs without directly taking over a state power. They exploited the companies directly taking over from state power. They exploited the country's resources to their own advantage, seriously compromising Chinese sovereignty and reducing the country to the status of a semi-colony. Almost everywhere, colony exploitation was challenged powerful nationalist movement. Nationalism, however, also arose without a colonial contest. As in the West or Japan, all nationalism are doctrines of popular sovereignty. Nationalist movement believe that political power should rest with the peoples, and this is what makes nationalism a modern concept. Civic nationalism vests sovereignty in all people regardless of the language, ethnicity, region, or gender. It seeks to create a community of right exercising citizens and defined nationhood in terms of citizenship, not ethnicity or religion. Ethic and religious nationalism try to build nation solidarity about a given language, religion, or a set of tradition, defining the people ethically, not in terms of common citizenship. In a multi-ethnic country, ethnic nationalist might limit the exercise of sovereignty to the chosen people, often assumed to be superior to minority communities. Today, most Western countries define their nationhood in terms of a common citizenship and not by a common ethnicity. One prominent had a long and troubled career going back to the reaction against the French imperial occupation of Germany state in 1806. Ideologies of civic nationalism have weighed with those of ethnic religious nationalism and world over, and this has been so in modern India, China and Japan as well. As the industrialization so with path of modernization, different societies have involved their distinctive modernities. The Japan and Chinese case, along with the stories of Taiwan and South Korea, are very interesting in the regard. Japan succeeded in the remaining free of colonies control and achieve fairly rapid economic and industrial process throughout the 20th century. The rebuild of the Japanese economy after a humiliating defeat in the Second World War should not be seen as a mere post-war miracle. Theme 7 shows it resulted with a certain gains that had already been accomplished in the 19th century. The early 20th century, did you know for instance that by 1910, tuition fee for studying at the primary school had not more or less ended and enrollment had become universal. Japan's path to modernization, like that of any other country, has had its own tensions. Those between democracy and militarism, ethnic nationalism and civil nation building, and between what many Japanese describe a tradition and westernization. The Chinese resist colonial exploitation and their own bureaucratic landed elite through a combination of peasant rebellion, reform and revolution. By the early 1930s, the Chinese Communist Party, which drew its strength from peasant mobilization, has begun confronting the imperial power as well as nationalists who represented the country's elite. It had also started implementing its ideas in the selected pockets of the country. Its egalitarian ideology, stress on the land reform, and awareness of the women's problem helped it overthrow foreign imperialism and nationalists in 1949. Once up in power, it succeeded in reducing inequalities, spreading education, and creating political awareness. Even so, the country's single party framework and state repression contributed to considerable dissatisfaction with the political system after the mid 1960s. But the Chinese Communist Party has been able to retain control over the country largely because in embarrassing certain market principle, it reinvented itself and has powered work to transform China into an economic powerhouse. The different ways in which various countries have understood modernity and sought to achieve it, each in the context of its own circumstances and ideas, make a fascinating story. This section introduces you to some aspect of that story. Timeline 4 from 1700 to 2000. In 1720 to 30, King Ajajaj of Damone in 1724 to 34. West Africa stops slave trade. It is reintroduced in 1740. In 1730 to 40, Europe has Carl Linnaeus invented a text money system to classify plants and animals in 1735. in 1750 to 60, first outbreak of smallpox in 1755 brought by the sailors in Cape Town, South Africa. 1770 to 80, peak of international slave trade. All the colonial powers are involved in it. Several hundred thousands black Africans are taken across the Atlantic every year. As many as two-thirds die on the board ship itself. In Europe, Emilian Pugachev had a peasants' uprising in 1773 to 75 that swept across the Russia. 1780 to 90, beginning of the French Revolution in 1789. 1800 to 10, Muhammad Ali rules Egypt between 1805 to 48. Egypt's break away from the Ottoman Empire. 2 minutes. क्या है? Beginning of French Revolution in 1789. Muhammad Ali rules Egypt in 1805 to 48. Egypt's break away from the Ottoman Empire. 1820 to 30. Libya founded AD 22 in the West Africa as home for freed slaves. In Europe, Louis Braille developed a system of finger reading in 1823. Passenger trains introduced in England in 1825. 1830 to 40. Abdali Kabir leads Arab resistance in 1830 to 47 against French presence in Algeria. 1840 to 50. Liberal and socialist movement in the several European countries in 1848. In Africa, in 1860, Suez Canal, one of the most important trade routes, one of the most important trade routes in the world opens in 1869. Russia surged as freed in 1861. 1817 and 1880, Germany and Italy emerged as unified nation states. 1880 to 90, beginning of the European scramble for Africa. 1890 to 1900, in Europe, making of the first film in 1895. The modern Olympics are held for the first time in Athens in 1896. 1900 to 1900, Mahatma Gandhi advocated satyagraha to resistance racist law in 1906 in South Africa. 1910 to 1920, South Africa introduced law to reserve 87% of land for whites in 1913. First World War between 1940 to 1918, the Russian Revolution in 1917. 1920 to 1930, Turkey became a republic under the Mustafa Kemal. 1930 to 40, first trans-African railways from Angola to Mozambique completed in 1931. Hitler captures power in the Germany in 1933. Second World War in 1939 to 1945. 1940 to 1950, Afrikaner Nationalist Party wins power in the South Africa. 1948, the policy of the upper hand is first in the place. Britain recognized Irish independence in 1949. 1950 to 60, Ghana is the first country in the sub-Sahara Africa to become independent in 1957. Discovery of DNA, Russia launches the spacecraft Sputnik in 1957. 1960 to 70, modernization of African unity power in 1963. Protest movement in Europe in 1968. In 1980 to 1990, Mikhail Gorbachev, leader of the USSR, 1985. Beginning of the World Wide Web in 1989. 1990 to 2000, Nelson Mandela freed in the South Africa in 1990. Process of the dismantling apprehend begins. In Europe, scientists cloned the sheep dolly in 1997, raising new debates about the limits of the genetic engineering. Now in Asia and the South Asia basically a region of India. 1920 to 1930, Jin Tsuang Jiang, the largest encyclopedia ever printed, commissioned by the Khanzi, the Manchu ruler of China. In 1740 to 50, Maratha extended control over northern India. 1750 to 60, Ankoli Konyo, a Japanese scholar, compiles a Dutch-Japanese dictionary. In South Asia, Robert Clive defeated Siraj-ud-Dowla, Nawab of Bengal at Battle of Plassey, जिसमें मीर जाफर are the betrayal. 1760 to 1780 to 90, British export of opium from India to China expands dramatically. It is ended with a opium war in China. In 1790 to 1800, Raja Ranjit Singh founded Sikh Kingdom in Punjab in 1799. In 1820 to 30, Japanese revolt against the Dutch in 1825 to 30. In India, practice of sati made illegal by William Bentinck. In 1830 to 40, Ottoman Sultan Abdul Majid start a program of modernization in 1839. In 1850 to 60, King Rama IV rules Thailand, opened the country to foreign trade in 1853. Railway and the telegraph line introduced in 1853. The Great Revolt 1857, संतावन की क्रांति. 1860 to 70, French begin to occupy Indochina, Southeast Asia in 1862. 1870 to 1880, opening of the first Japanese railway Tokyo to Yokohama in 1872. In India, famine in the Deccan. Southern India, 1876 and 78, over 5 million died. Famine, death due to the food. 1880 to 90, Britain annexes Burma, the Myanmar War in 1885 to 1866. Foundation of Indian National Congress in 1885. 1900 to 10, Japanese Navy defeated Russian fleet in 1905. 1910 से 1920, Balfour Declaration promises homeland for the Jews in the Palestine. 1920 to 1930, non-cooperation movement in 1921 launched by the Mahatma Gandhi. E.V. Ramaswamy Niketar launches the self-respect movement in the Tamil Nadu in 1925. 1930 to 40, opening of British oil pipeline from Iraq to Syria. In India, Alam Ara by the Ardish Irani is the first Indian talk film. Indian talk basically black and white film with audio. Berlin and Baghdad railway linking Baghdad to Istanbul begins operation in 1940. 1940 to 50, USA drop atom bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, killing of approximate 120,000 civilians. Many more were to die later through the effect of the radiation. Formation of People's Republic of China in 1949. Quit India movement 1942 in India, and Pakistan became independent state in 1947. 1950 to 60, Bagford Conference strengthened the non-aligned movement. India became a republic in 1950, 26 January 1950. 1960 to 70, Arab leaders set up Palestine Liberation Organization to unite Palestine refugees in 1964. War in the Vietnam 1965 to 73, basically a hegemony war between USA and USSR. Shri Mao Bandaranaike became the world's first woman prime minister in 1960 of Sri Lanka. 1970 to 1980, Shah of Iran is overthrown in 1975. Bangladesh emerged as an independent nation in 1971. The Bangladeshi Liberation War done by India. 1980 to 90, mass declaration for the democracy in Tiananmen Square, Beijing, China. The use of tank to demolish the protest. A leak at the Union Carbide pesticides plant in Bhopal in 70, methyl isocyanide in 1984 leads to one of the worst industrial disasters in the history. Thousands die. 1990 to 2000, Gulf War between Iraq and Kuwait and USA. India and Pakistan conducts nuclear tests in 1998. In America and Australia subcontinents. 1720 to 30, Portuguese introduced coffee in Brazil in 1727. The areas below the America till the Argentina is called Latin America. And in Brazil, Portuguese introduced coffee in 1727. In India, Portuguese introduced potato, and tobacco. In Australia Pacific Islands, Dutch navigator Rovigier reaches Samoa Island and Eastern Island in the Pacific in 1722. 1730 to 40 Stono slave rebellion led by the literature slave Jemmy in 1739. 1740 to 50 Juan Santos, also called the Atahualpa II, leads the Native Americans of Peru in unsuccessful revolt 1742. 1750 to 60. 1760 to 70 Chief Pentonic of the Ottawa tribes lead protest against the British. Ottawa in Canada. 1763. First in Australia, first of Captain James Cook 3 voyages to the Pacific in 1768 to 1701. 1730 to 80 US Declaration of Independence in 1776. 1780 to 90 US Constitution drawn up, dollar first used as American currency in 1787. In Australia subcontinent, first British commanded ship to the Botany Bay, Australia in 1788. In 1800 to 1810, Matthew Flinders circumnavigated then names Australia. It means southern. 1801 to 3. 1820 to 1830, Simon Bolivar lead Venezuela to independence. 1830 to 14, trials of triers in the USA. Thousands of Eastern Native Americans are forced to move west. Many died on the way in 1838. In Australia, Charles Darwin set out voyages to the Pacific Galapagos Island, which is the west of Ecuador, Galapagos Island in 1831, leading to the development of theory of evolution. Basically, now Charles Darwin chapter is removed from the NCERT. 1840 to 50, meeting the Seneca Falls, New York, calls for the equal right for American women in 1848. British and the Maoris in the New Zealand signed Treaty of Waitanagi in 1940. This was followed by a series of the Maori uprising in 1844 to 88. 1850 to 60, beginning of the first ruler steamship service between Australia and England in 1856. In 1860 to 70, civil war in USA, 1861 to 65. 30th Amendment to the Constitution outlaws slavery by Abraham Lincoln. A transportation of the prisoner to Australia from Britain ends in 1868. 1870 to 80, invention of telephone, record player, electric bulb. 1880 to 90, invention of Coca-Cola in 1886. 1890 to 1900, Australia, voting right for women in the New Zealand in 1893. 1900 to 1910, Wright brothers invented the aeroplane in 1903. In 1910 to 1920, Henry Ford begins assembly line production of cars in 1913. Panama Canal linking the Atlantic and the Pacific open in 1914. Influenza epidemic kills 1/5 of the population of the Western Samoa in 1918. In 1920 to 30, US Wall Street Stock Exchange crashes in 1929. Great Depression follows by the 1932. 12 million are out of work. In Australia, uprising of the Mau people of Samoa against New Zealand government in 1929. In 1940 to 30, US entered Second World War. In 1950 to 60, Fidel Castro comes to the power after the Cuban Revolution in 1958. 1960 to 70, Civil Rights Amendment in the USA, 1963. US Civil Rights Act 1954 ban racial discrimination. Civil rights leader Martin Luther King is assassinated in 1968. US astronaut landed on the moon in 1969. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. 1970 to 80, US Congress passes Equal Opportunity Act in the response to the Women's Movement 1972. Tonga and the Fiji gain independence from the Britain in 1970. Papua New Guinea gained independence from Australia in 1975. In 1980 to 19, New Zealand declares nuclear free zone. 1984, Treaty of the Rotorua set up South Pacific nuclear free zone in 1986. Just wait 2 minutes. I'm coming. Displacing indigenous people. This chapter recounts some aspect of the history of native peoples of America and Australia. Theme 8 describes the people of Spanish and Portuguese colonization of South America from the From the 18th century, more ideas of South America, Central America, North America, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand come to settle by the immigrants from Europe. This led to many of the native peoples beginning push out other areas. The European settlements were called colonies. When the European inhabitants of the colonies became independent of European mother country, these colonies became states or country. In 19th and 20th century, peoples from Asia countries also migrated to some of these countries. Today, these European and Asian from majority in these countries, and number of native inhabitants are very small. They are hardly seen in the towns, and the peoples have forgotten that they once occupied much of the country, and the names of many river, towns, etc. are derived from the native names, example Ohio, Mississippi, and Seattle in the USA, Saskatchewan in the Canada, Wollongong and Parramatta in the Australia. Till the middle of the 20th century, American and Australian history textbooks used to be describe how Europeans discovered the America and Australia. They hardly mention the native peoples except to suggest that they were hostile to Europeans. These peoples were, however, studied by anthropologist in the America from the 1840s. Much later, from the 1860s, the native peoples were encouraged to write their own histories or to dictate from them. This is called the oral history. Today, it is possible to read historical work and fiction written by the native peoples, and visitors to museums in these countries will see galleries of native art and especially museum which shows the aboriginal way of life. The new National Museum of American Indian in the USA has been curated by the American Indian themselves. European imperialization. The American empires of Spain and Portuguese in theme 8 did not expand after the 17th century. From that time, other countries, France, Holland, and England, began to annex their trading activities to establish colonies in America, Africa, and Asia. Ireland also was virtually a colony of England. As the landowners, they are mostly English settlers. From the 18th century, it became obvious that while it was the prospect of profit which drove people to establish colonies, there were significant variation in the nature of control established. In South Asia, trading companies like the East India Company made themselves into political power, defeated local rulers, and may annex their territories. They retained the older, well-developed administration system and collected taxes from the landowner. Later, they built railways to make trade easier, excavated mines, and established big plantations. In Africa, Europeans traded on the coast, except in the South Africa, and only in the late 19th century did they venture into the interior. After this, some of the European countries reached an agreement to divide up African and colonies for themselves. The word settlers used for the Dutch in the South Africa, the British in Ireland, New Zealand, and Australia, and the European in America. The official language in these colonies was English, except in Canada, where French is also an official language. Name given by Europeans to countries of New World. America, the first used after the publication of Travels of the Amerigo Vespucci. Canada, from Kanata, village in the language of the Huron Iroquois, as heard by the explorer Jacques Cartier in 1535. Australia, 16th century, named for land in the Great Southern Ocean. Austral in the Latin for the south. New Zealand, name given by the Tasman of Holland, who was the first to sight these islands in 1642. Z is the Dutch for she. Geographical Dictionary, 1805 to 22, list over 100 place names in the America and Australia which begin with New. North America, the continent of North America extended from the Arctic Circle to the Tropic of Cancer, from the Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean, west of the chain of the Rocky Mountain in the deserts of Arizona and Nevada, still further west to the Sierra Nevada mountains, to the east or the Great Plains, the Great Lakes, the Valley of the Mississippi and the Ohio, and the Appalachian Mountain. To the south is Mexico. 40% of the Canada is covered with the forest. Oil, gas, and minerals resources are found in the many areas, which explains the many big industrial in the USA and Canada. Today, wheat, corn, fruit are grown extensively, and fishing is a major industry in Canada. Mining industry and extensively agriculture have been developed only in the last 200 years by the immigrants from Europe, Africa, and China. But there were people who had been living in the North America for thousands of years before the Europeans learned from its existence. The native peoples. The earlier inhabitant of the North America came from the Asia over 30,000 years ago on the land bridge across the Bering Strait, and during the last ice age 10,000 years ago they moved
further south, the oldest artifact found in America, an arrow point in 11,000 years old. The population started to increase about 5,000 years ago when the climate became more stable. What is native means? Native means a person born in the place she lived in till the early 20th century. The term was used by the European to describe the inhabitants of countries they had colonized. At sunset on the day before America, that is, before the American reached there and gave the continent this name, diversity lay at every hand. People spoke in more than 100 tongues. They lived by every possible combination of hunting, fishing, gathering, gardening, farming, opening to them. The quality of soil and the efforts required to open and tend them determined some of their choices of how to live. Culture and the social basis determines other surpluses of fish or game or garden plants or meat help create powerful triad societies here but not there. Some cultures had endured for the millennia. William McLean, The Day Before America. These peoples live in bands, in villages along river valleys. They ate fish and meat and cultivated vegetable and maize. They often went on long journeys in the search of meat, chiefly that by bison and wild buffalo that roamed the grasslands. This became easier from the 17th century when the natives started to ride horse, which they brought from the Spanish settlers, but they only killed as many animals as needed for food. They did not attempt extensively agriculture, and since they did not produce a surplus, they did not develop kingdom and empires as in Central and the South America. There are some instances of the quarrels between tribals over territory, but by the large control of land was not an issue. They were content with the food and settlers were got from the land without the feeling any other to own it. An important feature of their tradition was that of making formal alliance and friendship and exchanging gifts. Goods were obtained not by buying them, but as gift. Numerous languages were spoken in North America. Through these were not written down. They believed that time moved in cycle and each tribe had accounts about their origin and their earlier history, which were passed on from one generation to the next. They were skilled craft people and move beautifully textiles. They would read the land and they could understand the climates and other landscape in the way literate people read written text. Encounters with the Europeans. Different terms are used in English for the native peoples of the New World. Aborigine, native peoples of Australia in Latin, ab from origin, the beginning. Aboriginal, adjective often misused as a pronoun, as a noun. American Indian, Amerindian, native peoples of the North and the South America and the Caribbeans. First Nation peoples, the organized native groups recognized by the Canadian government. The Indian Act of 1876 used the term bonds, its bands, but from the 1980 the word nations is used. Indigenous people, people belonging naturally to the place. Native Americans, the Indigenous people of the Americas. This is the term now commonly used. Red Indian, the brown complexes people whose land Columbus mistook for India. A picture of a woman of Benibago tribe of Wisconsin in 1860. People of these tribes were moved to Nebraska. It was indicated on the some tablets that the Hopis are the native tribes who now live near California in USA. Hopis had that the first brothers and sisters that would came back to them would come to as turtles across the land. They would as human beings, but they could come as turtles. So when the time came close to the Hopkins, they had a special village to welcome the turtles that would come across the land, and they got up in the morning and looked out at the sunrise. They looked out across the desert and they saw the Spanish conquistadors coming, covers in the armor like turtles across the land. So this was them. So they went out to the Spanish men and they extended their hand, hoping for the handshake, but into the hand the Spanish men dropped a trinket. And so word spread throughout North America that there was going to be a hard time, that maybe some of the brothers and sisters has forgotten and scaredness of all things, and all the human beings were going to suffer from this on the earth. From a talk by Lee Brown in 1986. In the 17th century, the European traders who reached the north coast of the North America after a difficult 2-month voyages were relieved and to find the native peoples friendly and welcoming. Unlike the Spanish in the South America, who were overcome by the abundance of the gold in the country, these adventurers came to trade in the fish and the fur, in the which they got the willing help by the natives who were expert in hunting. Further south along the Mississippi River, the French found that the native held regular gathering to exchange handicrafts unique to a tribe or food items not available in the other region. In exchange for local products, the European gave the native blankets, iron vessels, which they used sometime in the place of their clay pots, guns, which was used supplement for bows and arrows to kill animals, and alcohol. This last item was something the native had not known earlier, and they became addicted to it, which suited the Europeans because it enabled them to dictate terms to trade. The European acquire from the native an addiction to tobacco. Go back. 1497, John Cabot reaches the Newfoundland in Canada, American colonies. In 1505, Amerigo de Vespucci travels publishes. In 1534, Jacques Cartier traveled down the St. Lawrence River and met the native peoples. In Quebec, 1608, French found the colonies of Quebec. American in 1605, British found the colony of the Virginia. In 1602, British found the Plymouth in the Massachusetts. Mutual perception. In the 18th century, Western Europe defined civilized people in the terms of literacy and organized religion and the urbanizing. To them, the native of the America appeared uncivilized. To some, like the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, such peoples were to be admired as they were untouched by the corruption of civilization. A popular term was the noble savage. Some liner in a poem by a English poet William Wordsworth indicated another perspective. Neither he nor the Rousseau had not met a Native American, but Wordsworth described them as living admire wild, where fancy heart small liberty to grace the affection to exalt them or refine. meaning that people living close to the nature had not limited power of imagination and emotion. Thomas Jefferson, third president of the USA and a contemporary of the Wordsworth, spoke of the natives in the words that would lead to the public outcry today. This unfortunate race, which we have been talking so much in pains to civilize, have justified extermination. It is interesting to note that another writer, Washington Irving, much younger than the Wordsworth and who had actually met native peoples, described them quite differently. The Indians and have had an opportunity of seeing in real life are quite different from those described in poetry. Textually, they are, it is true, when in company with white men whose goodwill they distrust and whose language they do not understand. But the white man is equally tactful under like circumstances. When Indians are among themselves, they are great mimics and entertain themselves excessively at the expense of the whites, who have supposed them impressed with profound respect for their gradual and dignity. The white men, as I have witnessed, are prone to the treaty the poor Indians as little better than animals. To the native, the goods are exchanged with the Europeans were gifts given in friendship. For European dreaming of becoming rich, the fish, the furs were commodities which they were sell for a profit in the Europe. The prices of goods they sold vary from year to year depending on the supply. The native could not understand this. They had no sense of market in the faraway Europe. They were puzzled by the fact that the European traders sometimes gave them lot of things in the exchange for their goods, sometimes very little. They were also saddened by the greed of the Europeans. In their impatience to get the fur, they had slaughtered hundreds of the beavers. Europeans. Many folk tales of the native mock Europeans and describe them as greedy and deceitful. But because these were told as the imaginary story, it was only much later that Europeans understood the references. In the impatience to get the fur, they had slaughtered hundreds of the beavers, and natives were very uneasy, fearing that animals would take revenge on them for their destruction. Following the first European who were traders were those who came to settle in America. From the 17th century, there were group of Europeans who were being persecuted because they were of the different sect of Christianity. Protestant living in the predominant Catholic countries or Catholic in countries where Protestantism was the official religion. Many of them left Europe and went to the America to begin a new life. As long as they was vacant land, this was not a problem, but gradually the Europeans moved further inland near native village. They used their iron tools to cut down forests to lay out farm. Native and Europeans saw different things when they look at the forest. Native identified track visible to the Europeans. Europeans imagined the forest cut down and replaced by the cornfield. Jefferson's dream was a country populated by the Europeans with a small farm. The native who grew crops for their own needs, not for sale and profit, and thought it wrong to own the land, could not understand this in the Jefferson view. This made them uncivilized. Canada. In 1600, French treaty with the natives of the Quebec. Quebec is the district of a state of Canada in which many peoples live here as French, and they are
French speaking peoples. In 1763, Quebec conquered by the British. In 1774, Quebec Act. In 1791, Canada Constitutional Act. In USA, 1781, Britain recognized USA as an independent country. In 1783, British gave Midwest to the USA. These are the colonies of basically this is the colony of Britain. The countries that are known as Canada and United States of America came into existence at the end of the 18th century. At the time, they occupied only a fraction of land they now cover. Over the next 100 years, they extended their control over more territory. To reach their present size, large areas were acquired by the USA by purchase. They brought land in the south and from France, the Louisiana Purchase, and from Russia, Alaska. And by the war, much of the southern USA was won from Mexico. It did not occur to anyone that the consequence of native living in these areas could have been asked. The western frontier of the USA was shifting one, and it moved from the native also were forced to move back. Canada. 1837 French Canadian Rebellion. 1840 Canadian Union of Upper and Lower Canada. 1859 Canada Gold Rush. 1867 Confederation of the Canada. 1869 to 85 Red River Rebellion by the Métis of the Canada. 1876 Canada Indians Act America. 1885 Transcontinental Railways link east and the west coast of Canada. USA 1803 Louisiana purchased from the France. 1825 to 58 natives in the USA moved to reserve. 1832 Justice Marshall Judgment. 1849 American Gold Rush. 1861 to 65 American Civil War. 1865 to 90 American Indian Wars. 1870 Transcontinental Railways from New York to Los Angeles. 1890 to 90 Bison almost exterminated in 1892 end of the American frontier.
The landscape of America changed drastically in the 19th century. The European treaty and the land differently from the natives. Some of the migrants from the Britain and France were younger sons who would not inherit their father's property and therefore were eager to own land in America. Later, there were waves of the immigrants from the countries like Germany, Sweden, Italy, who had lost their lands to big farmer and wanted farms they could not own. People from Poland were happy to work in the prairie grasslands, which reminded them of the steppes of their homes, and were excited at being able to buy huge property at very lower price. They cleared land and developed agriculture, introducing crop, rice and cotton, which could not grow in Europe and other therefore could be sold there for profit. To protect their huge farm for wild animals, wolf and the mountain lion, these were hunted to extinction. They felt totally secure only with the intention of the barbed wire in 1873. The climate of southern region was too hot for Europe to work outdoors, and experience of the South America colonies had shown that the natives who had been enslaved had died in large numbers. Plantation owners therefore brought slaves in Africa. Protest by the anti-slavery groups led to the ban on the slave trade, but Africans who were in the USA remained slave and did their children. The northern state of USA, where the colony did not depend on the plantation and therefore on slavery, argued for ending slavery, which they condemned as inhuman practice. In 1861 to 65, there was a bar between the state that wanted to retain slavery and those supported abolish. The latter, once slavery was abolished, thought it was only in the 20th century that the African Americans were able to win the battle for the civil liberty. The segregation between white and the non-whites in the school and the public transport was ended. The Canadian government had a problem which was not to be solved for a long time, and which seemed more urgent than the question of the natives. In 1763, Canada had been won by the British after a war with the France. The French settlers repeatedly demanded autonomous political status. It was only in the 1867 that this problem was solved by organizing Canada as the Confederation of Autonomous States. The native peoples lose their land. In USA, as settlement expanded, the native peoples were induced up or forced to move. After signing treaties selling their lands, the prices paid were very low, and they were instances were when the America term used to mean the European people of the USA, cheating them by the taking more land or paying less than promised. Even high officials saw nothing wrong in the depriving the native people of their land. This is seen by an episode in the Georgia, a state in the USA. Officials has argued that the Cherokee tribes were governed by the state law, but could not enjoy the rights of the citizen. This was despite the fact that of all the native peoples and the Cherokees were the ones who had made the most efforts to learn English and to understand the American way of life. Even so, they were not allowed to the right of citizens. In 1832, an important judgment was announced by the U.S. Chief Justice John Marshall. He said that the Cherokees were a distinct community, occupying its own territory in which the laws of the Georgia has no force, and that they had sovereignty in certain matters. US President Andrew Jackson had a reputation for fighting against economy and political privilege. But when it came to the Indians, he had a different person. He refused to honor the Chief Justice judgment. He ordered the US Army to evict the Cherokees from their land and drive them to the great American desert. Of the 15,000 people thus forced to go, over a quarter died along the Trail of the Tears. Those who took the land occupied by the tribes justified it by saying the native did not deserve to occupy land which they did not use to maximize. They went to the criticize them for being lazy since they did not use their craft skills to produce good for the market and for being interested in the learning English or dressing correctly, which meant like the Europeans, they deserved to die out. They argue the prairies were cleared for farmland and wild bison killed off. Primitive man will disappear with the primitive animals, wrote a visiting Frenchman. Activity comment on the two sets of the population data. Natives in USA 1820 0.6 million, Spanish America in 1800 7.5 million natives, whites 9 million in 3.5 million, mixed European 0.1 million 5.3 million, blacks 1.9 million 0.8 million, total population 11.6 million, total population 16.9 millions. Meanwhile, the native were pushed westward, given the land as were there in perpetuity, but often moved again in any mineral, lead or gold or oil was found on their land. Many tribes were pushed to share the land originally occupied by one tribe, this leading to the quarrels between them. These were locked off in the small areas called reservation, which often was land which a land with which they had no earlier connection. They did not give in without a fight. The US Army crushed a series of the rebels from 1865 to 90, and the Canada there were armed revolt by the Métis, people of the native European descent between 1869 to 1825, but after that they gave up. In 1865, the President of USA received a letter from the native leader, Chief Seattle. The President has asked the chief to sign a treaty giving up a large part of land they lived on the American government. The chief replied, "How can you buy or sell the sky, the warmth of the land? The idea is strange to us. If you do not own the freshness of the air and sparkle of the water, how can one buy them? Every part of the earth is scared to my people. Every shining pine needle, every sandy shore, every mist in the dark wood, every clearing and every human insect in the holly, in the memory and the experience of my people. The sap which courses through the trees carry the memories of the red man." So, when the great chief in Washington sent words that he wishes to buy our land, he asked reserve us a place so that we can live comfortably. He will be poor father and he will be his children, so he will consider your offer to buy our land. But it was not easy, for this land is scared to us. The shining water that move in the stream and the rivers is not just water, but the blood of our ancestors. If we sell you land, you must remember that it is scared, and you must teach your children that it is scared, and that each ghostly reflection in clear water of the lakes tell of the events and the memories in the life of my people. The water murmurs in voice of my father's father. The gold rush and the growth of industry. There was always the people that there was gold in the North America. In 1840, traces of gold were found in the USA, in California. This led to the gold rush when thousands of the eager Europeans carried to America in the hope of the making a quick fortune. This led to the building of the railway line across the continent, and for which thousands of the Chinese workers were recruited. The USA railway was completed by 1870. That was Canada by 1885. The old nation creep on at a snail pace.
said Andrew Carnegie, a poor immigrant from Scotland who became one of the first millionaire industrialists in the USA. The Republic thunders on at the speed of an express. One reason why the Industrial Revolution happened in the England when it did not when it did was because small peasants were losing their land to big farmers and moving to jobs in the factories. In North America, industrial industries developed for very different reasons. To that, rapid transport could link distant peoples and to produce machineries which which would make large-scale farming easier. Industrial towns grew and the factories multiplied both in the USA and Canada. In 1860, the USA has been undeveloped economy. In 1890, it was leading industrial power in the world. Large-scale agriculture was also expanded. Vast areas were cleared and divided into farms. By 1890, the bison had almost been exterminated, thus ending the life of the hunting and the native had followed for the centuries. In 1892, the US continental expansion was completed. The area between the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean was divided up into the states. There was no longer remained the frontier that has pulled European settlers west for Germany decay. Within a few years, the USA was settling up its own colonies in Hawaii and the Philippines. It has become an imperial power. Constitutional right, the democratic spirit which had been the rallying cry for the settlers in the air fight for the independence in 1770 came to define the identity of the USA against the monarchies and aristocracies of the old world. Also important to them was that their constitution included the individual right to property, which the state could not override, but both democratic rights, the right to vote for representative to Congress and for the president, and right to property were only for the white man. Daniel Paul, a Canadian native, pointed out in the 2000 that Thomas Pyle, the champion of the democracy at the time of the War for Independence and the French Revolution, used the Indians as model of how society might be organized. He used this to argue that the Native Americans, by their example, sowed the seed for the long drawn out movement towards the democracy by the peoples of Europe. We were not the savages. The wind of changes. Not till 1920 did things begin to improve for the native peoples of the USA and Canada. The problem of Indian administration, a survey dictated by the social scientist Lewis Mirren in the published in the 1928, only in the few years before the USA was swept by a major economic depression that affected all its people, painted a grim picture of the tribal poor, health and education facilities for the native in the reservation. White Americans felt sympathy for the natives who were being discouraged from a full exercise of their culture and simultaneously denied the benefit of citizens. This led to landmark law in the USA, the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934, which gave natives in reservation right to buy land and take loan. In 1950 and 1960, the USA and the Canada government thought of ending all the special provisions for the native in the hope that they could join the mainstream that in adopt European culture, but the native did not want this. In 1954, in Declaration of the Indian Rights prepared by them, a number of the native peoples accepted citizenship of the USA, but on condition that their reservation would not be taken away from their tradition and could not be interfered with. A similar development occurred in the Canada. In 1969, the government announced that they could not recognize the Aboriginal rights. The native, in a well-organized opposition moved, held a series of the demonstration and debates. The question could not be resolved until 1982, when the Constitution Act accepted the extinct Aboriginal and treaty right of the natives. Many details remain to be worked out,
total, it is clear that the native peoples of the both countries through reduced so much in numbers from what they have been in the 18th century have been able to assert their rights to their own culture and particularly in Canada to their sacred lands in a way their ancestors could not have done in 1860. Indians under British rule. Text arbitrary seen as non-equal rationalization not ready for responsibility for the native government. Natives in America and not seen as citizens, not equal in the Australia. Rationalization primitive has no settled agriculture provision for the future towns. Americans lives in America. Denied personal liberty, not equal rationalization. Slavery is a part of their own social system. Black peoples are inferior. In Australia, as in America, human habitation in Australia has a long history. The Aboriginals, a general name given to a person of different society, began to arrive on the continent over 40,000 years ago, possibly even earlier. They came from the New Guinea, which were connected to the Australia by a land bridge. In a native tradition, they did not came to the Australia but had became been there. The past centuries were called the dream time. Sometime difficult for Europeans to understand since the distinction between past and present is blurred. In the late 18th century, there were between 350 and 750 native communities in Australia, each with its own language. Even today, 2000 of this language were spoken. There is another large group of the indigenous people living in the north called the Torres Strait Inlanders. In the term Aborigine, it is not used for these as they are believed to have migrated from the elsewhere and belong to the different race. Together, they make up 2.4% of Australian population in 2005. Australia is sparsely populated, and even now, most of the towns are along the coast, where the British first arrived in 1770 because the central region is arid desert. The European reached Australia in 1606. Dutch traveller sight Australia. 1642 Tasman lands on the island later named Tasmania. 1770 James Cook reaches Botany Bay named New South Wales. 1788 British penal colony formed. Sydney founded. The story of the interaction between the European settlers, the native peoples, and the land in the Australia has many points of similarity to the story of the Americans. Through it began nearly 3000 years later. Initially, reports from the Captain Cook and his crew about encounters with the native are enthusiastic about their friendliness. There was a sharp reversal of the feeding on the part of the British when Cook was killed by the native. Not in Australia but in Hawaii, as often happened, a single incident of this nature was used by the colonizers to justify subsequently act of violence towards other peoples. A description of the Sydney area in 1790. Aboriginals productions have been dramatically disturbed by the British prisons. The arrival of the thousands hungry mouths, followed by the 100 more, but preceded pressure on local food resources. So, what would be the drunk people have thought of all this? To them, such large-scale destruction of the sacred places and the strange violent behavior towards their land was inexplicable. The newcomers seemed to knock down trees without any reason, for their being not making canyons, gathering brush, many or the catching animals. Stones were moved and the stalks together. Clay dug up, shaped, and the cooked holes were made in the ground. Large unwieldy structure built. At first they may have equated the clearing with the creation of the scared ceremony ground. Perhaps they thought a huge ritual gathering was to be held dangerously business from which they could steer well clear. This is no doubt that drunks subsequently avoided the settlement for for only way to bring them back to the official kidnapping. They did not foregrees that in 19th and 20th century, nearly 80% of them would die by exposure to the germs, by loss of their land and resources, and in battle against the settlers. The experiment of settling Brazil and Portuguese convicted has been abandoned, with their violent behavior provoked angry repulsive from the natives. The British has adopted the same practice in American colonies until they became independent. Then they continue in Australia. Most of the early settlers were convicted who had been deported from England, and then their jail term ended. They allowed to live as free people in Australia on condition that they did not return to Britain, with no recourse but to make a life for themselves in their land so different from their own. They felt no hesitation about ejecting native from their land and took over for cultivation. The development of Australia. In 1850, self-government granted to Australian colonies. 1851, Chinese coolie immigration stopped by law in 1855. 1851 to 61, gold rush. 1807, formation of Federation of Australia with 6 states. 1811, Canberra established as capital. 1948 to 75, 2 million Europeans migrated to Australia. The economic development of Australia under European settlement was not as very as in America. Vast sheep farm and mining stations were established over a long period and with much labor, followed by the vineyards and the wheat farming. These came to form the basic of the country's prosperity. When the states were united and it was decided that new capital be built for the Australia in 1911, one name suggested for it was the wool wheat gold. Ultimately, it was called Canberra. Canberra, a native word meaning meeting place. Some natives were employed in the farm under the condition of work so harsh that it was little different for slavery. Later, Chinese immigrants provided cheap laborers as in California, but it is about being dependent on the non-white led to the government in the both countries to ban Chinese immigrants. Till 1974, such was the popular fear that dark people from the South Asia or Southeast Asia might migrated to Australia in large number. That was a government policy to keep non-white peoples out. The wind changes. In 1968, peoples were electrified by a lecture by the anthropologist W.E.H. Stadner entitled The Great Australian Silence. The silence of historians about the Aborigines from the 1970s as the happening in the North America. There was an eagerness to understand natives not as anthropological curiosity but as communities with distinct cultures, unique ways of understanding culture and the climate, with a sense of community. With had vast bodies of stories, textile and painting has craving skills, which would be understood and recorded and respected. Underlying it was the urgent question which Henry Renaud later articulated in a powerful book, Why We Are Not Be Told. This condemned the practice of writing Australian history as through it had begun with the Captain Cook's discovery. Since then, university departments have been instituted to study native culture. Galleries of native arts have been added to the art galleries. Museum has been enlarged in incorporate dioramas and immigrant design. room explaining native cultures, and the native have begun writing their own life histories. This has been a wonderful effort. It has also occurred at a critical time, because if native culture has remained ignored by this time, much of such cultures would have been forgotten. From 1974, multiculturalism has been official policy in the Australia, which gave equal respect to native cultures and to different cultures of the immigrants from Europe and Asia. This is the poem Two Dream Times, written by the Odo Rogis Nonushin. You can read the poem. I'm just coming. From the 1970s, as term human rights began to heard at the meeting of the UN and other international agencies, the Australian public realized with diminy that in contrast to the USA, Canada and New Zealand, Australia has no treaties with the native formalizing the takeover of land by Europeans. The government had always termed the land of Australia terra nullius, that is belonged to nobody. There was also a long and agonizing history of children of mixed blood native Europeans being forcibly captured and separated from the native relatives. Agitation around these questions led to the inquiries uh, and to two important decisions. One, to recognize that the natives had strong historic bonds with the land which has scared to them, and with which respected to that will past act could not be undone. There should be a public apology for the injustice done to the children in attempt to keep white and colored people apart. In 1974, white Australian policy ended Asian immigrants allow entry. In 1992, Australian High Court in the Mabo case declared that the terra nullius was legally invalid and recognized native claims to land from before 1770. In 1995, national inquiry into the separation of Aboriginals and Torres Strait Inlanders children from their families. In 1999, 26 में a national sorry day as apology for the children lost from the 1920s to 1970. These are some easy questions. Comment on any points of differences between native peoples of South and North America. Uh, Knowing to topography differences, South Americans were hunter-gathering gatherers, agriculture and herders. They were simple peoples contented with their names. In North America, native peoples used to live native peoples in North America, native peoples used to live in band in villages along the river valleys. They ate fish and meat and cultivated vegetable and maize. The native of the South America maintained empire, while the native of North America did not maintain it. Question 2. Other than the use of English, what other feature of English economy and the social life do you notice in the 19th century USA? In the 19th century, the landscape of America changed immersively. The European treaty the land in the different ways. Some of the migrants from the Britain and France were eagerly to have their own land in America, in the prairie grassland. People from Poland were happy to work. They wanted to buy huge property at low cost. They cleared land and developed agriculture. They introduced crops which could not grow in the Europe and therefore could be sold for the profit. To protect their farms, they hunted wild animals. With the invention of the barbed wire in 1873, they felt totally secured. Question 3. What is the frontier means to the America? The conquest and purchase of land by the Americans resulted in the extension of boundaries. The native of America were compelled to move accordingly. The boundary were native reach as known as frontier. Why was the theory of Australian natives people left out of the history books? European settlers and the native peoples interacted on the issue of the land after the emergence of North America. They were displaced by the European. Early settlers were convicted, deported from England. Hence, they were unknown to the area. They had not even their own tradition and history. Nothing has been written in America and Australian history textbook about the native peoples. That is why Australian native peoples were left out of the history. It could be made possible from the decades of the 1960s that native peoples started keep their record. How satisfactory is a museum gallery explaining the culture of the people? This example from the museum gallery display the culture of the people in the following way. In the museum gallery, we seek information regarding the dialects and the language. Remain of pots, sparrows, ornaments, and other things are displayed. Books, research paper, survey report, and the work of historians and archaeologists are kept in the gallery of museum. Icons of the ancient period, the theology is in its basic form, and coins are found in the museum. In fact, the museum is a storehouse. All things symbolized culture of human being from prehistoric period to present. These things display culture of the respective period. Now, next chapter, path to modernization. East Asia at the beginning of 19th century was dominated by China. The Qing dynasty, here to a long tradition, seemed to secure its power, while Japan, a small island country, seemed to be locked in isolated. Yet, within a few decades, China was thrown into the tumbling, unable to face the colonial challenge. The imperial government lost political control, was unable to reform effectively, and the country was convulsed by the civil war. Japan, on the other hand, was successfully in the building a modern nation state, creating an industrial economy, and even established a colonial empire by the incorporating Taiwan in 1895. Korea in 1910. It defeated China, the land that has been source of its culture and ideas. In 1894, the Russia and the European power in 1905. China reacted slowly, and they faced immense difficulties as they sought to redefine their tradition to cope with the modern world and to rebuild their nation, strengthen, and to become free from the Western and the Japanese control. They found that they could achieve both objectives by of removing inequalities and of rebuilding their country. Through revolution, the Chinese Communist Party emerged victorious from the civil war in 1949. However, by the end of the 1970s, Chinese leaders felt that the ideological system was retarding economic growth and development. This led to the wide-ranging reform of the country that brought back capitalism and the free market even as the Communist Party retained political control. Japan became an advanced industrial nation, but its drive for empire led to war and defeat at hands of the Anglo-American forces. The US occupations marked the beginning of a more democratic political system, and Japan rebuilt its economy to emerge by the 1970s. As a major economic power, the Japanese path to modernization was built on the capitalist principle and took place within a world of dominating by Western colonialism. Japanese expansion was justified by the call to resist Western domination and liberate Asia. The rapid development underlined the strength of the tradition in the Japanese institute and society, their ability to learn and strength of the nationalism. China and Japan had a long tradition of historical writing. As history was an important guide for the rulers, the past provided the standards of which they would be judged, and the ruler established official department to maintain record and write dynastically stories. Sima Qian is considered the greatest historian of the early China. In Japan, Chinese culture influence led to the historian being given a similar importance. One of the earliest acts of the Meiji government was to establish in the 1869 a bureau to collect, record, and write as it were a victor version of the Meiji Restoration. There was a great respect for the writing world and the literary ability that was highly valued. This has hint that a wide range of written materials, official histories, scholars writing, popular literature, religious tracts are available. Printing and the publishing were important industries in the pre-modern period, and it is possible, for instance, to trace the distribution of a book in the 18th century China or Japan. Modern scholars have been has used material in new and different ways. Modern scholarship has built on the work of the Chinese intellectuals such as Liang Qiang or the Qin Tang. In 1839 to 1931, one of the pioneers of the modern history in the Japan, as well as earlier writing by the European travelers such as the Italian Marco Polo between 1252 to 1324 in China, from 1274 to 1290, the reduced priced Matteo Ricci between 1552 to 1610 in China, and the Louis Foris in 1532 to 97 in Japan, all of whom left rich accounts of these countries. It has also benefited from the writing of the Christian missionaries in the 19th century, whose work provided valuable material for our understanding of these countries. The scholarships in English from Joseph Needham's monumental work on the history of the science in the Chinese civilization, or the George Simon on the Japanese history and culture, has grown, and there is an immense body of the sophisticated scholarship available to us today. In recent years, writing by the Chinese and the Japanese scholars have been translated into English, some of whom teaches a board and write in English. And in case of the Chinese scholar, since in the 1980s, many have been working in the Japan as well as in the writing in the Japan. This has meant that we have scholarly writing and many parts of the globe that give us richer and the deeper picture of these countries. Nyato Konan, a leading Japanese scholar of China, Ninto Konan, writing influenced scholar worldwide. Using the new tools of the Western historical, Nyanto built on a long tradition of studying China as well as bringing his experience as journalist there. He helped establish the Department of Oriental Studies in Kyoto University in 1907. In Shenrong on the China in 1914, he argued that Republican government offered the Chinese a way to end aristocratic control and the centralization power that has existed since the Sung dynasty between 1910 to 1279. A way to revitalize local society where reforms must be begin. He saw a Chinese historian strengthen that would to make the democratic Japan he thought had an important role to play in China, but he underestimated the power of the Chinese nationalism. Introduction. China and Japan present a marked physical contrast. China is a vast continent country that spans many climatic zones. The core is dominated by the three major rivers: the Yellow River, which is Hangui River; Yangtze River, this is Changjiang, the third longest river in the world after Nile and Amazon, and the Pearl River. A large part of the country is mountainous, which is Tibet region. The dominant ethnic group are the Han, and the major language is Chinese, which is Putagua. But many other nationalities such as Uyghur, Huan, Manchu, and Tibetan, and aside from the dialects such as Hui, which is Cantonese, and Shanghainese, which is Wu, they are other majority languages spoken as well. Chinese food reflect this regional diversity with the least four distinct types. The best known in the southern or the Cantonese cuisine, as the most overseas Chinese came from the Canton area, which includes dim sum, literally touch your heart, an assortment of pastries and dumplings. In north, wheat is the staple food, while in the Sichuan, spices brought by the Buddhist monk in the ancient period along the Silk Route and chilies by the Portuguese trader in the 15th century have created a fiery cuisine. In eastern China, both rice and the wheat are eaten. Japan, by contrast, is a string of islands, the four largest being Honshu, Kyushu, Shikoku, Hokkaido. The Okinawan chain is the southernmost, about the same latitude as the Bahamas. More than 50% of the land area of the main island is mountainous, and Japan is situated in very active earthquake zone. This geographical condition has influenced architecture. The population is largely Japanese, but there are small Indian minority and Koreans who were forcibly brought as labor when the Korea was a Japanese colony. Japan lacks a tradition of animal rearing. Rice is a staple crop and the fish is the major source of protein. Raw fish, which is sashi or sushi, has now become a widely popular dish around the world as considered very healthy. Japan, the political system. And emperor had ruled Japan from Kyoto, but by the 12th century, the imperial court lost power to shoguns, who is the theory ruled in the name of the emperor from the 1603 to From 1603 to 1867, member of the Tokugawa family held in the position of shogun. The country was divided into 250 domains under the rule of the lords called daimyo. The shogun exercised power over the dominial lords, ordering them to stay at the capital Edo, modern day Tokyo, for long periods so that they could not pose a threat. He also controlled the major cities and the mines. The samurai, the warrior class, were the ruling light and served the shoguns and the daimyo. In the late 16th century, three changes led the pattern for the future development. One is the peasants was disarmed and only the samurais could carry swords. This ensured peace and the order, ending the frequent war of the previous years. Two, and the daimyo were ordered to live in the capital of their dominance, each with a large degree of the autonomy. Third, the land survey identify land and the taxpayer, and the graded land productivity ensure the stable revenue base. The daimyo capitals became bigger, so that by the mid 17th century, Japan not only had the most populated city in the world, Edo, but also the two other large cities, Osaka and Kyoto, and at least half a dozen castle towns with the population of over 50,000. By contrast, most European countries of the time had only one large city. This led to the growth of the commercial economy and created financial and credit system. A person's merit began to be more valued than his status. A vibrant culture blossomed in the towns were the fast growing class of the merchants, patronized theater and the arts. As people enjoying reading, it became possible for gifted writers to earn a living sociable by writing. In Edo, people could rent a book for the price of a bowl of noodles. This shows how popular reading and became, and gives a glimpse into the scale of the printing. Printing was done with the wood blocks, and Japanese did not like the regularity of the European printing. Japan was considered rich because its import luxury goods like silk from China and textile from India. Paying for this import with the gold and silver strained the economy and led the Tokugawa to put restriction on the export of the precious metal. They also took a step to develop the silk route in the Nijim in the Kyoto, and so as it reduced import. The silk from the Nishijia came to be known as the best in the world. Other development such as increased use of money and creation of a stock market in the rights shows that economy was developed in new ways. Social and the intellectual changes, such as the study of the ancient Japanese literature, led people to question the degree of Chinese influence and to argue that the essence of being Japanese could be found long before the contact with China. In early classes, as the tale of the Genji and in the myth of the origin that said that the island were created by the gods and the emperor was an descendant of the sun goddess. Tale of Genji. You can read the tale of Genji. The Meiji Restoration. Internal discontent considered with the demand for the trade and the diplomatic relation. In 1853, the US sent Commodore Matthew Perry 1794 to 1858 to Japan to demand that the government sign a treaty that would permit trade and the open diplomatic relation, which it did not. Following year, Japan lay to the route to the China, which the USA saw as a major market. Also, their whaling ships in the Pacific needed a place to refuel. At that time, there was only one Western country that traded with Japan, which is Holland. Perry's arrival had an important effect on the Japanese politics. The emperor, who till then had a little political power, now re-emerged as an important figure. In 1868, a movement forcibly removed the shogun from power and brought the emperor to Odo. This was made the capital and remained the Tokyo, which means Eastern capital. Perry ship, a Japanese woodblock print. Officials and the peoples were aware that some Europeans were building colony empire in India and elsewhere. News of the China being defeated by the British was flowing in, and this was even depicted in the popular plays, so that there was a real fear that Japan might be made a colony. Many scholars and leaders wanted to learn from new ideas in the Europe rather than ignore them in the Chinese were doing. Others sought in excluded the Europeans even while being ready to adopt the new technologies they offer. Some argue for the gradual and limiting opening in the outer world. The government launches a policy with the slogan Fukko Kyuko, rich country, strong army. They realized that they needed to develop their economy and build a strong army. Otherwise, they could face the prospect of being subjugated like India. To do this, they needed to create a sense of nationhood among the people and transform subject into citizen. It is same time the new government also worked to build what they called the imperial system. Japanese scholars use this term as the emperor was part of a system. Along with the bureaucracy and the military that exercised power, officials were sent to study the European monarchs on which they planned to model their own. The Europeans would be treated with the reverse as he considered a direct descent of the sun goddess, but he was also known as the leader of the westernization. His birth became a national holiday. He wore Western style military uniform, and edicts were issued in his name to set up the modern institute. The imperial rescript on the education of 1960 urged people to pursue learning, advance public good, and promote common interest. A new school system began to build from 1870. Schooling was compulsory for boys and girls, and by 1910 almost universal institution fees were minimal. The curriculum had been based on the Western model, but by the 1870, while infringing the modern ideas, stress would placed on the loyalty and the study of the Japanese history. The Ministry of Education exercised control over the curriculum and into the section of the textbook, as well as in teachers training. What was called moral culture had to be taught, and text urged children to revert their parents, to be loyal to the nation, and became good citizens. The Japanese had borrowed their written script from the Chinese in the 6th century. However, since their language is very different from the Chinese, they developed two phonetic alphabets, Hiragyan and Katanaka. Hiragyan is considered feminine because it is used by many women writers in the Heian period, such as Murasaki. It is written using a mixture of Chinese character and the phonetic, so that the main part of the word is written with a character. For instance, in go would be written with a small character, and ing is pathonic. The existence of a pathonic syllabary means that knowledge spread from the elites to the wider society relatively quick. In the 1880, it was suggested that the Japanese develop a complete pathonic script or adopt a European language. Neither was done. To integrate the nation, the Meiji government imposed a new To integrate the nation, Meiji government imposed a new administrative structure by altering old village and domain boundaries. The administrative unit had have revenue adequate to maintain the local schools and health facilities, as well as serve as a recruitment center for the military. All young men over 20 had to be period of military service. A modern military force was developed. A legal system was set up to regulate the formation of political groups, control the holding of the meeting, and impose strict censorship. In all these measures, the government has to face opposition. The military has bureaucracy were put under the direct command of the empire. This meant that even after a constitution was enacted, these two groups remained outside the control of the government. In all these measures, the government faced opposition. The tension between these different ideas represented by a democratic institution and a modern army was to have far-reaching consequences. The army pressed for a vigorous foreign policy to acquire more territory. This led to war with the China and Russia, in both of which Japan was the victory. Popular demand for greater bureaucracy was often in the opposition to the government aggressive policy. Japan developed economically and acquired a colonial empire that suppressed spread of democracy at home and put in collusive with the people it colonized. Modernizing the economy. Another important part of the Meiji reform was the modernizing of the economy. Funds were raised by the living on agriculture tax. Japan's first railway line between Tokyo and the port Yokohama was built in 1870-72. Textile machinery was imported from the Europe, and foreign techniques was employed in the trained workers, as well as to teach the universities and teach the universities and schools. The Japan students were sent abroad. In 1872, modern banking institutions were launched. Companies like Mitsubishi and Sumitomo were helped through subsidies and tax benefits to become major shipbuilders, so that Japanese trade was from now carried in Japanese ship. Zaibatsu, large business organization controlled by individual families, dominated the economy till after the Second World War. The population, 35 million in 1872, increased to 55 million in 1920. To reduce population pressure, the government actively encouraged migration, first to North Island of the Hokkaido, which have been a largely autonomous area where the indigenous people called Anu lived, and then to Hawaii and Brazil, as well as growing colonial empire of Japan. Within Japan, there was a shift to town as industries developed by the 1925. 21% of the population lived in the city by 1935. This figure had gone up to 32%, which is 22.5 million. Industrial workers. The number of people in manufacturing increased from 7 lakh in 1870 to 4 million in 1930. Most of them workers units employed less than 5 people and using either machinery nor electric power. Over half of those employed in the modern factories were women, and it was the modern women organized the first modern strike in 1886. After 1900, the number of men began to increase, but only in the 19th century did male workers begin to outnumber women. The size of factories also began to increase. Factories employing more than 100 workers, just over 1,000 in 1909, jumped over 2,000 by 1920 and 4,000 by 1930. Yet even in 1940, there were over 5,50,000 workshops that employed less than 5 employees. This sustained the family-centered ideology, just as nationalism was sustained by a strong patrilineal system under an emperor who was like an family patriarch. The rapid and unregulated growth of industry and demand for the natural resource such as timber, led to the environmental destruction. Tanakazaka Shoko, elected to the first House of Representatives, launched the first agitation against industrial pollution in 1897 with 800 villages in a mass protest forcing the government to take action. Aggressive nationalism. The Meiji constitution was based on a restricted franchise and create a diet. The Japanese used the German word for parliament because the influence of German legal ideas with limited powers. The leader who brought about the imperial restoration continued to exercise power and even established political parties. Between 1980 and 1931, popularly elected prime minister formed cabinet. Thereafter, they lost power to national unity cabinet formed across party lines. The emperor was the commander of force, and from 1890 this was interpreted to mean that the army and the navy had dependent control. In 1899, the prime minister ordered that only serving generals and admiral could become minister. This strengthening of the military together with the expansion of Japanese colonial empire was connected with the fear that Japan was at mercy of the Western power. This fear was used to silence opposition to the military expansion and higher tax to fund the armed forces. Westernization and tradition. Successive generation of Japanese intellectuals had different views on the Japan's relation with the other country. To some, that USA and the Western Europe countries were at the highest point of civilization, to which Japan inspired Fukuwajo Yoshio, a leading Meiji intellectual, expressed this by saying that Japan must expel Asia. He meant that Japan had shed its Asian characteristics and became part of the West. Fukuzawa Yukishi, just read about Fukuzawa and Yukishi. I am coming. The next generation questioned this total acceptance of the Western idea and argue that national pride be built on the indigenous value. The philosopher Miyaki Situsuri in 1860 to 1945 argued that each nation must develop its special talents in the interests of the world civilization. To devote oneself to one's country as to devote oneself to one world. By the contrast, many intellectuals were attracted to the Western liberalism and wanted a Japan based not on the military but on the democracy. Yuki Amori, 1857 to 1892, a leader of the popular right movement, was demanding constitutional government admire the French Revolution, doctrine of the natural rights of man and of popular sovereignty, and spoke of the liberal education that would develop each individual. Freedom is more precious than others. Others are advocated voting rights for women. This pressure led to the government to announce a constitution. Daily life. Japan transformed into a modern society can be seen also in the changes in the everyday life. The patriarchal house system comprises many generations living together under the control head by a house, but more peoples became affluent. New ideas of family spread. The new homes, a Japanese says, using the English word, was that of the nuclear family, where husband and wife lived a breadwinner and homemaker. This new concept of domesticity in turn generated demand for new types of domestic goods, new types of family entertainments, and new form of housing in the 1920s. Construction companies made cheap housing available for a down payment of 200 yen and a monthly installment of 12 yen for 10 years. This at a time when the salary of a bank employee, a person with the higher education, was 40 yen per month. Car club. You can reach the car club by pausing the video. Overcoming modernity. State-centered nationalism found full expression in the 1930s and 1940s as Japan launched war to extend its empire in the China and other part of the Asia, a war that merged into the Second World War after the Japan attacked the USA at Pearl Harbor. This period saw greater control on the society and the repression and imprisonment of dissidents, as well as formation of the patriotic society. Many of them women organized to support the war. An influential symposium on overcoming modernity. नीचे पानी काफी करते क्या काफी भी करेगा गूगल पे पढ़ने वाला an influential symposium on overcoming modernity in 1943 debate the dilemma facing Japan of how to combat the West while being modern. A musical Murai Saburu posed the question of how to rescue music from the art of the sensory stimulation and to restore it to an art of the spirit. He was not rejecting He was not rejecting Western music but trying to find a way that went to beyond merely rewriting or playing Japanese music on the Western instrument. The philosopher Nishitani Keiji defined modern as unity of the three streams of Western thought, the Renaissance and the Protestant reforms and the rise of a natural science. He argued that Japan moral energy, a term taken from the German philosopher Ranke, had helped it to escape colonization, and it was its duty to establish a new world order, a greater East Asia. For this new vision that would be integrated science and the religion was necessary. After defeat, re-emerging as global economic power, Japan attempted to carve out a colonial empire ended with its defeat by the Allied power. It has been argued that the nuclear bomb was dropped on the Hiroshima and Nagasaki to shorten the war, but others think the immense destruction and the suffering it caused was unnecessary. Under the US-led occupation 1945 and 47, Japan was demilitarized and a new constitution intrigued and had Article 9 and so-called no war clause that renounced the use of war as an instrument of the state policy. Agrarian reforms and re-establishment of the trade union and an attempt to dismantle the zaibatsu or large monopoly houses that dominated the Japanese economy were also carried out. Political parties were revived and the first post-war election held in the 1946, where women voted for the first time. The rapid rebuild of the Japanese economy after its shattered defeat was called the post-war miracle. But it was more than that. It was firmly rooted in its long history. The constitution was democratized only now, but Japanese had a historic tradition of the popular struggles and intellectual engagement with how to broaden political participation. The social cohesion of the pre-war years was strengthened, allowing for a close working of the government, bureaucracy, and industry. US support as well as demand created by the Korea and Vietnam War also helped the Japanese economy. In 1964, Japanese held in the Tokyo marked a symbolic coming of age. In much the time way, the network of high-speed Shinkansen or the bullet trains started in the 1964, which ran at 200 miles per hour. Now it is 300 miles per hour. Have become to represent the ability of the Japanese to use advanced technologies to produce better and the cheaper goods. The 1960s saw the growth of the civil society movement as industrialization had been pushed with utter disregard to its effect on the health and the environment. Cadmium poisoning, which led to the painful disease, was an early indicator, followed by the mercury poisoning in the Minamata in 1960 and problem caused by air pollution in the 1970s. Grassroots pressure began to demand recognition of these problems as well as compensation for the victims. Government action and the new legal regulation helped to improve conditions. From mid-1980s, there had been an increasing decline in the interest in the environmental issue as Japan enacted some of the strictest environmental control in the world. Today, as a developed country, it faced the challenge of using its political and the technological capabilities to maintain its position as a leading world power. China. The modern history of the China has revolved around the question of how to regain sovereignty and the humanization of foreign occupation and bring out equality and development. Chinese debate were marked by the views of three groups. The early reforms such as Kang Wang 1858 to 1927 or Liang Kwei-chako in 1873 to 1929 tried to use traditional ideas in the new and the different ways to meet the challenges posed by the West. Second, Republican uh, Republican revolutions such as the Sun Yat-sen, the first the first president of the republic, were inspired by the ideas from the Japan and the West. The third, the Communist Party of China (CCP), wanted to end age-old inequalities and driven out the foreigners. The bringing of the modern China can be traced to its encounter with the West in the 16th and the 17th century, when Jesuit missionary introduced Western science such as astronomy and the mathematics. Limited through its immediate impact was it was in motion event that gathered momentum in the 19th century was Britain. When Britain used forces to expand its lucrative trade in opium lead to the First Opium War. 1839 to 42, this undermined the ruling Qing dynasty and strengthened demand for the reform and the changes. Opium trade between British East India Company and China led to the Opium War. I can cross one. Qing reform, Qing reform, also known as Quang Yuan and Ling Kuai Chaiko, released the need to strengthen the system and the initiated policy to build a modern administrative system, a new army and a educational system, and set up local assemblies to establish constitutional government. They saw the need to protect China from colonization. The native example of colonial countries were powerful on the Chinese thinker. The partition of the Poland in 18th century was a much discussed example. So much that by the 1890 it came to be used as verb to Poland us. Blavo. India was another such example. In 1903, the thinkers Luang Quaicho, who believed that only by making people aware that China was a nation would they be able to resist the West, wrote that India was a country that was destroyed by a known country, that is East India Company. He criticized Indians for being cruel to their own peoples and subservient to the British. Such arguments carried a powerful appeal, as ordinary Chinese could see that British used Indian soldiers in their war on China. Above all, felt that traditional ways of thinking had to be changed. Confucianism developed from the teaching of the Confucius in 650 before Common Era, and this discipline was concerned with the good conduct, practitioner wisdom, proper social relation. It influenced the Chinese attitude towards right, provided social standards, and laid the basis of the political theories and institutions, and see as a major barrier to the new ideas and the institution. To train people in the modern subjects, students were sent to study in the Japan, Britain, and France and bring back new ideas. Many Chinese students went to Japan in the 1890s. They not only brought back new ideas, but many became leading Republicans. The Chinese borrow even Japan translation of Europe words such as justice, right, and revolution became because they use the same ideographic script, a rehearsal of the traditional relationships. In 1905, just after the Russo-Japanese War, a war fought on the Chinese soil and over Chinese territory, the centuries-old Chinese examination system that gave candidates entry into the elite ruling class was abolished. The examination system. Entry into the elite ruling class, about 1.1 million till 1850, had been largely through an examination. This required writing an 8-legged essay, Pa Tu Wen, in classical Chinese is a prescribed form. The examination was held twice every 3 years, at different level, and those allowed to sit only 1-2% passed at the first level. Usually by age of 24, to become what was called beautiful talent at any given time before 1850, there were also called 5,26,869 civil and 2,12,330 military provincial. Jiang Huang degree holders in the whole country. Since there were only 27,000 official positions, many lower level grade holders did not have jobs. The examination acted as a barrier to the development of science and technology, as its demand only literary skills. In 1905, it abolished as it was based on the skill in the classic Chinese learning that had it was felt no relevance for the modern world. Establishing the Republic. The Manchu Empire was overthrown and the Republic started in the 1911 under the Sun Yat-sen, 1862 to 1925, who is anonymously regarded as the founder of modern China. He came from a poor family and studied in the missionary school where he introduced to democracy and the Christianity. He studied medicine but was greatly concerned about the fate of China. His program was called the Three Principles, San Min Chu. There was nationalism. This meant overthrowing the Manchu, who were seen as the foreign dynasty. As a part as other foreign imperialists, democracy or established democratic government, and socialism regulating capital and the equalizing land holding. The social and the political situation continued to be unstable. On 4 May 1919, an angry demonstration was held in the Beijing to protest against the decision of the post-war peace conference. Despite being an ally of the victorious side led by Britain, China did not get back the territories seized from it. The protest became a movement. It galvanized a whole generation to attack traditional and to call for the saving China through modern science, democracy and nationalism. Revolutionaries called for driving out the foreigners who were controlling the country resources and to remove inequality and reduce poverty. They advocated reforms such as the use of simple language in writing, abolishing the practice of foot binding and the subordination of women, equality in marriage and economic development, and to end poverty. After the Republican Revolution, the country entered a period of turmoil. The Kuomintang, the National People's Party, and CCP emerged as the two major. Kuomintang and the National People's Party, and CCP, Chinese Communist Party, emerged as major forces striving to unite the country and bring stability. Sun Yat-sen idea became the basis of the political philosophy of the Kuomintang. They identify the four great needs as clothing, food, housing, and transportation. After the death of Sun Chiang Kai-shek in 1887 to 1975, emerged as the leader of the Kuomintang as he launches the military campaign to control the warlords. Regional leaders who had usurped authority and to eliminate the communists. He advocated a secular and the rational. This orderly Confucian, but also sought to militarize the nation. The peoples, he said, must develop a habit and instinct for unified behavior. He encouraged women to cultivate the four virtues of chastity, appearance, speech, and work, and recognized their role as the confined to the household. Even the length of the helminths was prescribed. The Kuomintang social base was in urban areas. Industrial growth was slow and limited. In cities such as Shanghai, which became the center of the modern growth by 1919, an industrial working class had appeared, numbering 5 lakh of these. However, only a small percentage were employed in the modern industries such as shipbuilding. Most were petty urbanites, Xiong Simin, traders and the shopkeepers. Urban workers, particularly women, earned very low wages. Working hours very long and the condition of the work bad. As individual increased, there was a growing concern with the woman's right, ways to build the family, and the discuss about the love and social and the culture changes was helped along by the spread of school and the university. Peking University was established in 1902. Journalism flourishing, respecting the growth attraction of the new thinking. The popular Life weekly, edited by the Zhuang Tuan in 1895 to 1944, is representative of this new trend. It introduced reader to the new ideas as well as to leaders such as Mahatma Gandhi and the Kamal Atankuri, the modernist leader of Turkey. It circulation increased rapidly from 2000 in 1926 to a massive 12 lakh copies in 1933. Kuomintang, despite its attempts to unite the country, failed because its narrow social base and limited political vision. A major plank in the Sun Yat-sen program, regulating capital, equalizing land, was ever carried out because the party ignored the peasantry and the rising social equality. It sought to impose military order rather than decrease the problem faced by the peoples. Timeline: Japan, 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu established the Edo Shogunate. In China, 1644 to 1911, Qing dynasty. In 1630, Japan closes country to the West power except for the restricted trade with the Dutch. In 1839 to 62, opium wars between British East India Company and China. 1854, Japan and the US conclude the Treaty of Peace, ending Japan's seclusion. In 1868, restoration of Meiji. 1872, compulsory education system, first railway line between Tokyo and Yokohama. 1889, Meiji Constitution enacted. 1894 to 95, war between Japan and China. 1904 to 1905, war between Japan and Russia. 1910 is Korea annexed colony till 1945. And in China, 1912, Sun Yat-sen founded Kuomintang. 1914 to 18, First World War. 1990, May 4th movement. In 1925, universal male suffrage, and in 1921, China CCP founded, Chinese Communist Party. 1931, Japan's invasion of China. In 1929 to 49, civil war in China. 1941 to 45, the Pacific War. In China, 1934, Long March. In Japan, 1945, the bomb drop on the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In 1946 to 52, US-led occupation of Japan, reform to democratize and demilitarize Japan. In China, 1959, People's Republic of China, Chiang Kai-shek founded Republic of China in Taiwan. In 1956, in Japan, Japan became a member of the United Nations. In 1962, China attacks India over border dispute. In 1964, Olympic Games in Tokyo for the first time in Asia. In 1966, Cultural Revolution. 1976, death of Mao Zedong and the Zhuang Ilage. In 1997, China, Hong Kong returned to China by Britain. Rise of the Communist Party of China. When Japanese invaded China in 1937, the Kuomintang retreated and the long and exhausting war weakened China. Prices rose 30% per month between 1945 and 1949, and utterly destroying the lives of ordinary people. Rural China faced two crises, one ecological with soil exhaustion, deforestation, floods, and the second social economic one caused by exploitation, land tenure system, indebtedness, primitive technology, and poor communication. The CCP had been founded in 1921. Soon after the Russian Revolution, Russia successfully exercised a powerful influence around the world, and leaders such as Lenin and Trotsky went on establish a Comintern or the Third International in March 1918 to help bring out a world government that could end exploitation. The contempt and the Soviet Union support Communist Party around the world, but they worked within the traditional Marxist understanding. The revolution would be brought about by the working class in the cities. Its initial appeal across the national boundaries was immense, but it soon became a tool for the Soviet interest and was dissolved in 1943. Mao Zedong, 1893 to 1976, who emerged as a major CCP leader, took a different path by basing his revolutionary program on the peasantry. His success made the CCP a powerful political force that ultimately won against the Kuomintang. Mao Zedong radically approach can be seen in the Xinjiang, in the mountains where they camped from the 1928 to 1934, secure from the Kuomintang attack. A strong peasant council, Soviet, was organized, united through confiscation and redistribution of land. Mao, unlike other leaders, stressed the need for an independent government and army. He had become aware of the woman problem and supported the emergence of the Rural Women Association, promulgated a new marriage law that forbade arranged marriage, stopped purchase or sale of the marriage contract, and simplified divorce. देवो पानी अनार the Kuomintang blockade of the communist Soviet forces the party to seek another base. This led them to go on what they to be called the Long March. Chamachik, the Kuomintang blockade of the communist Soviet forces the party to seek another base. This led them to go on what came to be called the Long March. 1934 to 35, 6,000 grueling and difficult miles to Shanxi, here in their new base in the Xi'an. They further developed their program to end the warlordism, carried out land reforms and the fight foreign imperialism. This won them a strong social base. In the difficult years of the war, the Communist Party and the Kuomintang workers together, but after the end of the war, the communists established themselves in the power and the Kuomintang was defeated. Establishing the new democracy 1949 to 65. The People's Republic of China government was established in the 1949. It was based on the principle of new democracy, an alliance of all the social class, unlike the dictatorship of the proletariat that the Soviet Union said. It was established critically areas of the economy were put under the government control, and the private enterprise and the private ownership of the land were gradually ended. This program lasted till the 1953, when the government declared that it would launch a program of the socialist transformation. The Great Leap Forward movement launches in the 1958 was a policy to galvanize the country to industrialize rapidly. People were encouraged to set up steel furnaces in their backyard. In the rural areas, people communes where land would be collectively owned and cultivated. Were started by the 1958. There were 26 communes covering 98% of the farm population. Mao was able to mobilize the mass to attain the goal set by the party. His concern was to create a socialist man who would have five love: fatherland, people, labor, science, and public property. Mass organizations were created of farm women, students, and other groups. For instance, the All China Democratic Women Federation had 76 million members. The All China Student Federation 3.29 million members. These objective and the method did not appeal to everyone in the party. In 1953 to 54, some were arguing for more attention into industrial organization and economic growth. Li Changko 1896 to 1969, the Zheng Zhuopi 1904 to 97 tried to modify the commune system as it was not working efficiently. The steel produced in the backyard furnace was an unusable industrial. Conflicting vision 1965 to 78. The conflict between the Maoist wanted to create a socialist man and those who objected to his emphasis and on ideology rather than imparting culminating and the Mao launching the Great Proletariat Cultural Revolution in 1965 to counter his critics. The Red Guard, mainly student and the army, was used for campaign against odd culture, old customs, old habits. Students and professionals were sent to the countryside to learn from the masses. Ideology. Being communist was more important than having professional knowledge. Denunciation and slogans replaced rational debate. The Cultural Revolution began a period of turmoil, weakened the party and the several disrupts the economy and educational system. From the late 1960s and the tide began to turn. In 1965, the party once again laid the emphasis on the greater social discipline and needed to build an industrial economy so that China could become power before the end of the century. Reform from 1978. The Cultural Revolution was followed by a process of the political maneuvering. Deng Xiaoping kept party control strong while introducing a social market economy. In 1978, the party declared its goal as the four modernization to develop science, industry, agriculture, defense. Debate was allowed as long as party was not questioned. In this new and liberating climate, as at the time of the May 4th movement, 60 years earlier, there was an exciting explosion of new ideas. On 5 December 1978, a wall poster, the fifth modernization, proclaimed that without democracy, the other modernization would come to nothing. It went to criticize the CCP for not solving the problem of poverty, for ending exploitation, even citing cases of such abuse from within the party. These demands were suppressed, but in 1989, on the 17th anniversary of the May 4th movement, intellectuals called for a great openness and to end the obfuscated dogmas. Su Shaanxi, students demonstrate at the Tiananmen Square in Beijing, were brutally repressed. This was strong condemned around the world. The post-reform period has been seen the emergence of the debate on the ways to develop China. The dominant view supported by the party is based on strong political control, economical liberalization and the integration into the world market. Critics argue that increasing inequalities between social groups, between religious and between men and women was creating social tensions and questions are heavy emphasis on the market. Finally, there is a growing rival of the earlier so-called traditional ideas of the Confucianism and argue that China can build a modern society following its own tradition rather than the simply copying the West. The story of Taiwan. Chiang Kai-shek, defeated by the CCP, fled in the 1949 to Taiwan with over 300 million in gold reserve and created crates of the priceless art treasure and established the Republic of China. Taiwan had been a Japanese colony since the Chinese seceded it after the 1894-95 war with Japan. The Cairo Declaration 1943 and the Potsdam Proclamation in 1949 restored the sovereignty of China. Massive demonstration in the February 1947 has led the GMD to brutally kill a whole generation of leading figures. The GMD under Chiang Kai-shek went on to establish a repressive government forbidding free speech and the political opposition and excluding the local population from position of power. However, they carried out land reforms that increased agriculture productivity and modernization the economy so that by 1973 Taiwan has GNP second only to the Japan in the Asia. The economy largely dependent on the trade has been steadily growing, but what is important is that the gap between rich and the poor has been steadily declining. It began slowly after the death of Chiang in 1975. The dream of Malcolm when martial law was lifted in 1987 and opposition parties were legally permitted. The first free election began the process of the beginning local Taiwanese to power. Diplomatically, most countries have only trade mission in Taiwan. Full democratic relations and embassies are not possible as Taiwan is considered to be part of China. The question of reunification with the mainland remains a contention issue, but cross-strait relation that is between Taiwan and China has been improving, and Taiwanese trade and investment in the mainland were massive. Travel has also become easier. China may be willing to tolerate a semi-autonomous Taiwan as long as gave up any more to the seek independence. Story of Korea. Beginning of modernization. During the late 19th century, Korea, Joseon dynasty between 1392 to 1910 faced internal political and social strife and increasing foreign pressure from China. Japan and West amidst this, Korea implemented modernization reform in its governmental structure, diplomatic relations, infrastructure and society after a decade of political interference. The Imperial Japan annexed Korea as its colony in the 1910, bringing the over 500-year-long Joseon dynasty to its end. However, the Korean people were angry about Japan's suppression of their culture and the forced assimilation. Desiring independence, Korea around the country demonstrated against the colonial rule, set up a provisional government and set delegation to appeal to the foreign leaders at international meetings such as the Cairo, Yalta, Potsdam conferences. The Japan colonial rule ended after 35 years in August 1935 with the Japan defeat in the World War II. However, it was the continued effort of independence activists both inside and outside Korea that ensured Korean independence after Japan's defeat. Following liberalization, the Korean peninsula was temporarily divided along the 38th parallel, with the Soviet managing the north and UN managing the south. Even as the nation worked to be disbanded the Japanese forces in the region. However, this division became permanent as separate governments were established in both north and the south in 1948. The post-war nation. In June 1950, the Korea War broken out, with South Korea receiving support from the US-led United Nations forces and North Korea receiving support from the Communist Party. It developed into a vintage proxy war of Cold Era. In July 1953, after 3 years, the war ended in a armistice agreement. Korea remained divided. The Korean War had caused not only massive loss of the life and property, but also a delay in free market economy. Development and democratization prices suddenly rose due to the inflation caused by increased national expense and the currency issue during the war. Furthermore, industrial facilities constructed during the colonial period had been destroyed entirely. As a result, South Korea was forced to rely on the economic resistance would be provided by the USA. Through South Korea first president Sangyam Rhee had been elected in 1948 through democratic process after the Korean War. He extended his administration twice through the illegal constitution amendment. In April 1960, citizens protested against the rigged election in what he known as April Revolution, and Rhee was forced to resign. With the revolution as an impulse, the spirit of people which has been suppressed during the Rhee administration, the Democratic Party administration, which took the power after the resignation, could not properly respond to the citizen demands due to the internal division and conflict. Rather, reform political power emerged. The students' movement grew into the unification movement. This was not looked upon the favorable by the military authority. In May 1961, Democratic Party government was overthrown in a military coup staged by the General Park Chung-hee and the other military authorities. Rapid industrialization under strong leadership. In October 1963, an election was held and military coup leader Park Chung-hee was elected the president. The Park administration adopted a state-led export-oriented policy to achieve economic growth. The 5-year economic plan of the government favored large corporate firms, placed emphasis on the expanding employment and increased Korean competitiveness. Korea's unprecedented rate of the economic growth began in the early 60s when the state policy shifted from the import institution industrialization ISI towards a focus on export. Under the export-oriented policy, the government supported labor-intensively light industrial products such as textile garments, in which Korea had a competitive advantage. During the late 1960s and 1970s, the focus again shifted from the light industry to value-added heavy and chemical industry. Steel, non-ferrous metal, machinery, shipbuilding, electronics, and the chemical production were selected as the most important industries in the race of economic growth. In 1970, the new village Saimol movement was introduced to encourage the mobilize the regular population and modernize the agricultural sector. This campaign aimed to reform the spirit of the peoples from the being passive and disheartened to becoming active and hopeful. Rural people were empowered to help themselves in developing their village and improve their living condition of their respective communities. The movement was later expanded to assist the neighborhood near industrial plants and in urban areas. Today, Korea is sharing the knowledge and experience from this movement with the developing countries who wish to adopt the principle of Salomon movement in their development efforts. Korea achieved starlighting economic growth thanks to a combination of strong leaders, well-trained bureaucrats, aggressive industrialization, and a capable labor force. Ambitious entrepreneurs responded well to the government incentives to increase export and develop new industries. The high level of education also contributed to the economic growth of Korea. At the dawn of the Korean industrialization, almost all Korean workers were already literate and could easily acquire new skills. At the same time, the country's open economic policy worked to absorb more advanced institutions and technology from other countries. Foreign investment and the Korean high domestic saving rate helped develop the heavy industrial sector, while remittance from the South Korea workers overseas also contributed to overall economic development. Economic growth was the foundation of the Park administration long-term power. Park revised the constitution so that he could run for a third term and was re-elected in 1971. In October 1972, Park declared and implemented the Russian constitution, which made permanent presidency possible. Under the Russian constitution, the president has complete authority over the legislation, jurisdiction and administration, and also had a constitutional right to repeal any law as an emergency measure. As the president was invested with the absolute authority, the progress of democracy was temporarily suspended in the pursuit of economic development. However, the second oil crisis in 1979 enacted as the inheritance of the economic policy, which has over-invested in the heavy chemical industry. Moreover, student, scholar and the opposition continually demonstrated against the Russian constitution. As the Park administration invocation of emergency measure and suppress brought about political instability amidst his economic crisis and the political instability. The Park administration came into end in the October 1979 when the Park Chung-hee was assassinated. Continue economic growth and calls for democratization. The desire for the democratization grew upon the death of the Park Chung-hee, but in December 1979 another military coup, this time led by the Chung Dong-hwang, was staged. In the May 1980, various protests in the key cities around the nation were held by the students and the citizens demanding democracy to face by the Chung military faction. The military faction suppressed the democracy movement by implementing martial law across the country. In the city of the Gwangju, in particular, students and citizens did not back down and demanded that the martial law be ended. This is known as the Gwangju democratization movement. However, Chung military faction suppressed the protest of democratization. Later that year, Chung became the president through an indirect election under the Russian constitution. The Chung administration strengthened the suppression of the democratization influence in order to establish the regime. Due in part of the international economic boom, the Chung administration was unable to rise economic growth from 1.7% in 1980 to 13.2% in 1983, while also significantly lowering inflation. Economic development was led to the urbanization, improving education level and media advancement. As a result, citizens' self-awareness about political rights grew, leading to the demand for the constitutional amendment to allow direct election of the president. In May 1987, the Chung administration minimalization of inquiries into the death by torture of a university student was made known, making citizens being participated on large-scale struggle for democratization. The June democracy movement that followed had participated not only by students but middle class as well. Owing to these efforts, Chung administration was forced to make a revision to the constitution allowing the direct election. A new chapter of Korean democracy thus being added. Korean democracy and IMF crisis. As per the new constitution, the first direct election since 1971 was held in December 1987. But due to the opposition party failure to unite, a fellow military leader of Chung military faction, Roh To-wo, was elected. However, Korea continued along the path of the democracy. In 1990, long-time opposition leader Kim Hwang-sang compromised with the Roh party to create a large ruling party. In December 1992, Kim, a civilian was elected the president after the decade of military rule. With this election, the consequent dissolution of authoritarian military power, democracy made its forward march. Under the export-driven policy of the new administration, several companies grew to global prominence, which continued until the earlier 1990. With the governmental support, Korean conglomerates invested in the capital-intensive heavy and the chemical industry, as well as in electronic industry, while the government continued to focus on building industrial and social infrastructure. Meanwhile, under increasing neoliberalist pressure to open its market, the Kim administration joined the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in 1996 and attempt to strengthen Korean international competitiveness, but amidst increasing trade deficit, poor management by the financial institution, reckless business operation by the conglomerates, and more, Korea was met with a foreign currency crisis in 1997. The crisis was dealt with through emergency financial support provided by the International Monetary Fund. Simultaneously, efforts were also made to improve the contributed towards the foreign loan repayment through the gold collection movement. In December 1997, along the time, opposition party leader Kim Dae-jung was elected the president for the first time. In Korea, making a peaceful transfer of power. The second peaceful transfer of power came into 2008 when the conservative Lee Myung-bak was elected as the president, following as the progressive Roh Myung administration in the 2012. Conservative Park Geun-hye was elected as the first female president. At the beginning of her presidency, she gained support due to the political legacy of her father Park Geun-hye. But in October 2016, government as it came to light that she are the friendly, secretly managed government affairs, she met with nationwide protests, leading to her impeachment and removal from office in the March 2007. In May 2007, Moon Jae-in elected the president in the peacefully transfer of power for the third time. The candlelight protest of 2016, led by the citizens who peacefully demonstrated for the president's resignation within the boundaries of the democratic law and system, shows the maturity of the Korean democracy. The Korean democracy owns a debt to economic development, but it was the citizen elevated political awareness to encourage the republicanism in the country, which played the lead role in the advancing it to where it was today. Two road of modernization. Industrial society, far from the becoming like each other, have founded their own paths to become modern. The history of Japan and China, along with the stories of Taiwan and Korea, show how different historical conditions led them widely divergent power to build independent and modern nation. Japan was successful in retaining its independence and using traditional skills and practice in a new way. However, its elite-driven modernization generated an aggressive nationalism helped to sustain a repressive regime that justified, designated, and demands for democracy, and establish a colonial empire that left a legacy of hatred in the region, as well as distorted internal development. Japan's program of modernization was carried out in an environment dominated by the Western imperial power, while it imitated them to attempt it to its own solution. Japanese nationalism was marked by this defensive compulsion, while many Japanese hoped to liberate Asia from Western dominate. For others, these ideas justified building an empire. It is important to note that the transformation of social and political institutions and daily life was not just a question of reviving tradition or tendency preserving them, but rather of the creating, using them in new and different ways. For instance, the Meiji school system moduled on the European and American practice introduced new subject, but curriculum main objective was to make loyal citizens. A course on the moral that states loyalty to the emperor was the compulsory. Similarly, changes in the family or the daily life showed how foreign and indigenous ideas were brought together to create something new. Chinese path to modernization was very different. Foreign imperialism, both Western and Japanese, combined with the hesitant and unsure Qing dynasty to weaken government control and set the stage for the breakdown of political and social order, leading to the immense misery for most of the people. Warlordism, banditry, and civil war extracted a heavy toll on the human lives, as did the savages of Japanese invasion. Natural disaster added to this burden. The 19th century and the 20th century saw a rejection of the traditionalism and search for the ways to build national unity and strengthen. The CCP and its supporters brought to put an end of the tradition which they saw. As keeping the masses in poverty, the women subjugated and the country undeveloped, while calling to the power to the peoples, it built a highly centralized state. The success of the communist program promised hope, but its repressive political system turned the ideas of the liberation and equality into the slogan to manipulate the people. Yet it did remove centuries-old inequality, spread education, and raise the consciousness among the people. The party among carried out market reforms and been successfully in the making China economically powerful, but its political system continues to tightly controlled and the society now faces growing inequality. As now revival of the traditional long suppressed, this new situation again poses the question of how China can develop by retreating the heritage. What was the major developments before the Meiji Restoration that made it possible for Japan to modernize rapidly? And this is the conclusion part. Just a reading notes and questions that we are going to do. The following development helped the modernization of Japan before the Meiji Restoration. Peasants were not allowed to carry arms. Only samurai would carry swords now. Growth of population led to the growth of the commercial economy. Efforts were made to develop silk routes. People developed reading habits. The export of precious metal restricted. Theaters and arts were patronized in town. Land survey were made. Discuss how daily life was transformed as Japan developed. Earlier in Japan, the patriarchal household system prevailed. In it, many generations lived together under the control of a head of the family. New ideas of the family spread. The new home was a nuclear family where husband and wife together. The new concept of the domesticated generated demand for new types of domesticated goods and new forms of farming. How did Qing dynasty try and meet the challenges posed by the Western power? The Qing dynasty could not meet the challenges posed by the Western powers. They utterly failed. Qing dynasty also demanded changes in the country, but they also failed in this endeavor. What were the Sun Yat-sen three principles? The three principles was nationalism, democracy, and socialism. Did Japan's policy of rapid industrialization led to the war with the neighbors and the destruction of the environment? The rapid industrialization in Japan led to the destruction of environment to the region. The development of industry affected the environment in many ways. It led to the exploitation of natural resources to obtain raw material for the consumption of flourished product, the need of the colonial world. Think that Mao Zedong and the Communist Party of China was successful in liberating China and the basis of the current process. It is true that Mao Zedong and the Communist Party of China was successful in the liberating China and the laying basis of its current success. In 1925, after the death of Sun Yat-sen, the Kuomintang was headed by the Chiang Kai-shek. Previously, the Communist Party of China was founded in 1921. He tried his best to strengthen the rule of the Kuomintang, but no initiative were taken to achieve the three revolution principle of Sun Yat-sen, that is nationalism, democracy and socialism. He also made an attempt to raise a new class of landlords. They also exploited the peasantry. Mao Zedong, a communist leader, formed the Red Army. It was formed to strengthen the peasant movement. He became a chairperson in 1930. He also started a guerrilla war against the Chiang Kai-shek army. He defeated Chiang army 4 times, but for fifth time he left the idea of war and started the Long March. Mao Zedong formed a communist front against the Japan in 1935. It was his opinion that his struggle against Japan would make his mass movement more effective. He suggested that the United Front be formed in collaboration with the Red Army, but Chiang completely denied his process and he impersed by his own soldier. The increasing power of Mao Zedong worried the Chiang Kai-shek. He did not interested in the working with him. Even then, he came with the Mao in the war against Japan. After the end of war, Mao put the proposal of coalition government before Chiang Kai-shek, but he denied. Mao continued his struggle and elected the chairperson of Chinese government. Chiang Kai-shek was worried about increasing power of Mao Zedong. After many persuasion, he became ready to stand by Mao against Japan. In 1949, Chiang fled to Formosa to seek asylum. Mao was elected as the chairperson of Chinese government. He held his office till his death. And the book is ended. Thank you.